All right, Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, and we are currently maxed out at 4K, and we're not really holding 60 FPS, although it is completely playable. Now, the main thing in this game that you'd want to turn down, if you just want to adjust one setting, it's the volumetric fog, which honestly has a huge performance impact, but looks, I don't know, pretty much the same. I mean, you guys judge for yourself, but let's turn volumetric fog all the way down to low. And hey, look, we're at 60 FPS now. Do you feel like things suddenly look terribly worse? I sure don't. But basically, I would say if you want to play this game at around 4K 60 on the RX 6800 XT, all you gotta do is turn down that volumetric fog. Now, I'm not saying there aren't other things you could turn down. There certainly are. But I think that if I was playing this game at 4K, this is probably what I would do. Although we are gonna go ahead and test the actual game presets. So, let's go down to the actual Ultra preset, which, by the way, does just turn volumetric fog and screen space reflections to high instead of Ultra. So we'll notice that our performance is still below 60 FPS at times, although this gets us pretty close. Again, it's that volumetric fog, that pesky fog, man. There's your problem. Okay, well, let's say we wanted to play at 4K, but we want better than 60 FPS. Let's see if playing down at the high settings will get us there. Now, watch as it fades in. You can see some differences with the draw distance, that kind of thing, when compared with Ultra. But overall, high does look very similar to Ultra, still looks quite good. And it does stabilize the frame rate quite a bit. I think this is another way to quite easily be at or above 60 FPS in most situations at 4K. So let's go ahead and test out some more stuff. Let's try out what if we wanted to play at medium. Well, now, like, look out at this treasure chest. See how there's grass around it at high? If we go down to medium, the grass retreats way back to here. Also, the anti-aliasing switches to FXAA rather than TAA. So I'm not saying you really should turn this much stuff down, but you certainly can turn this much stuff down if you would like to be playing at 4K at around 100 FPS, which is quite good performance, and really the game still looks pretty much fine at medium settings. I don't think it's a huge compromise. Still definitely good, and I like to see that the game is quite scalable between its settings. You really don't need to play games at maxed out settings. A lot of times turning things down really does look about the same, but perform a whole lot better. Let's go ahead and even try turning down to the low settings. Now, I don't think this is worth it. Notice that the grass barely extends at all into the distance, but our performance is quite good now. Well over 100 FPS. And so, you, I guess, could do this. Now, this game doesn't seem to feature any kind of FSR or DLSS or anything fancy. It has its own resolution scaler, but it doesn't have a lot of adjustability. And I don't think I recommend using it. So let's go ahead and actually drop down to 1440p, because I know a lot of people don't have a 4K screen. So at 1440p, let's see if we can absolutely max things out. Let's apply the settings. Okay, so maximum settings at 1440p. And it looks like we are hanging out in the 90 to 100 plus range. Let's play on it a bit just to see if that remains to be the case. So as usual, our RX 6800 XT is a very good 1440p performer. There's your maximum settings. However, I really do think the maximum settings in this game are kind of throwing away some performance, and going down to high can certainly be worth it, and you do get a bit of a performance boost by doing that. Let's get some more enemies on the screen. Yeah, it feels very smooth. All right, let's go ahead and try out the medium settings at 1440p, just in case you're like, I bought a 165 hertz monitor. Actually, I guess this would go well over that. Let's punch some skeletons. Hey, hey, oh, I'm pushing C instead of V. I'm a mouse button melee person. I just haven't adjusted my controls in this game, really. So yeah, it looks like we are around the 200 FPS mark if we go down to medium settings. Let's just for giggles see how far we can push things by going down to low. So if you got that 240 hertz monitor, I guess it's not going to always stay that high, but it certainly will at times. Although I don't think that's worth it, even if you have the monitor. But if you like low settings and lots of frames, that is your business. And I'm not going to tell you no. You do you, man. I just want you to be happy. All right, should we go ahead and try out 1080p for those esports gamers out there who have their 6800 XT at 1080p to just get absolutely maximum frame rates in their favorite esports titles of choice? Well, here you go. Maxed out at 1080p. We are bouncing around between 130 and 150, 160 FPS. So, seems pretty good. Let's get some more skeletons on the screen. All right. Now, once again, even at 1080p, I feel like the maximum settings in this game are a little unnecessary. Let's go down to high. Now seems like we are much more stably well into the mid 150 plus range. Bam! Let's just smack some skeletons with an axe before we go. All right. For the sake of completion, we might as well test out the last couple of settings. Let's see how we do at medium. Still not pushing 300 FPS, guys. Can we break 300? It looks like the GPU usage is not quite locked in at 99% anymore, so we might be starting to see the limits of my 5950X and RAM. I wonder if going down to low could get us anything else, but I think we're really at the CPU limits now. Yeah, you can see the GPU usage is down into the 70% range, meaning we are definitely at the limits of my CPU and GPU. So if you wanted to know how many frames a 5950X can push in this, with some 32 gigabytes of 3600 CL, did I get CL16? I think I did. RAM, you can check my video description. All right, this is the RTX 3080 12 gigabyte, and I've got it at stock settings, not overclocked or anything. And this is Tiny Tina's Wonderlands at 4K maximum settings. I was curious if we'd be able to hit 60 FPS at those settings, and the answer is no, but we're pretty close. I mean, you know, if I'm staring at a wall, we're over 60, but in general, we are definitely dipping below 60 depending on what I'm looking at, you know? With the enemies on screen and everything here, definitely not going to be completely maxed out to 60 FPS. So what could we do? Well, there's a whole bunch of graphic settings that we could play with. Now, one thing I didn't mention in some of my other videos on this game is there is a resolution scaler. So when you're at a high resolution like 4K, sometimes just turning it down a little bit is good, except as far as I can tell, this is not very granular. I can go from 100% to 75% to 50%, which is just silly. So unfortunately, I'm going to say that we could do it, and it does boost performance, but now I can tell I've lost a lot of sharpness compared to native 4K. I would have loved if I could have just done maybe a, you know, maybe like a 90% resolution scale just to get from 55 FPS up to 60 FPS, see if that got us the last little bit, and then keep everything else maxed out. That would have been really nice, but yeah, it seems like that is just not one of the options. It wants to take these big jumps, and if you're wondering if this had any kind of DLSS or FSR, I can't really see any in the settings, so I would say no, I don't see those as options. We're definitely going to go back to 100%, and we are also going to actually apply the changes, and then we'll play around with the settings a little bit. On the absolute maximum settings, if you just go down one down to ultra, all it does is adjust the volumetric fog and the screen space reflections down to high, and it also doesn't seem to have much of a performance difference. So we could see if it did just get us that last little bit to 60 FPS, but unfortunately, seems like we're still dipping a little below 60 at times. So it's seeming like absolutely maxing the game out at 4K. I mean, certainly playable, especially on a variable refresh rate screen. It's like, well, 55, 60, it's not that big of a difference. So you certainly could play the game like this. I wouldn't object to it. Although personally, in a first-person shooter, I'm going to be shooting for a higher frame rate target. So let's go ahead and try out the high settings. By the way, notice that you can actually see the changes. It loads it up live for your viewing delight. So honestly, it doesn't look that different between Ultra and High, which is nice, but our frame rate does seem to jump up quite a bit. So if we just play at 4K High instead of 4K Ultra, things honestly look about the same. At the Ultra settings, things almost seemed a tad bit blurrier. I noticed this on my other graphics card testing as well. So there's actually some setting that I actually kind of like better at High than at Ultra. Things seem a little bit crisper to me. And now the frame rates are quite good. So I think this is definitely more than playable at 4K. I think at 4K High, this feels very, very smooth. And you would have absolutely no trouble, and like I said, I think certain elements of the image look better at High than they do at Ultra, and it certainly doesn't look noticeably worse. So I think this is going to be my recommendation for how I would play it at 4K, although a lot of people in a first-person shooter are going to want things to be even faster on the FPS. So let's go down to medium settings at 4K. Looks like we are now getting up into the 90s, even passing 100 FPS at times, which is fantastic. Get some more enemies on the screen here to make sure that we can maintain that. Yeah, seems absolutely solid. So if you want a really high refresh rate experience, even at 4K, going down to medium will do the trick. Now, not everybody with a RTX 3080 has jumped up to 4K. A lot of people still playing at 1440p, and I know there's a few of you 1080p users out there, even with a extremely high-end GPU. So let's go ahead and jump down to 1440p. And let's go ahead and see if we can completely max things out at 1440p. So, 1440p maximum settings. Honestly, the frame rate seems pretty similar to what we were getting at 4K medium. Again, something at these maximum settings, to my eye, looks just a little bit hazy or blurry. I don't know. I'm not a fan. But yeah, looks like you can absolutely max the game out at 1440p without any real issues. Although I'm curious if we went ahead and dropped down to high, how high our frame rate would be. So 1440p high settings do seem to be more consistently around that 120 FPS, like really high refresh rate kind of experience. Let's get some enemies on the screen here just to see what that's like.
No one is left to walk these halls. No one living.
So, skeletons.
All right, yeah, so I don't want to kill my last few skeletons here for performance testing. I think that's as low as I would bother going, personally, at 1440p. So why don't we go ahead and drop down to 1080p. So we're now at 1080p, and turn it up to absolute maximum settings. All right, so maxing the game out at 1080p. You do seem able to stay well over 100 FPS. That does not seem to be an issue. And turning down settings, you certainly could. I'm not sure what the point would be exactly, but hey, you certainly could. Why don't we try out the high settings just to kind of be complete enough on our testing here. So it looks like at 1080p high settings you're on a 165 hertz display, you know, at 1080p. You're going to be just fine. Oh, looks like we dip a little bit below it here and there. Alright guys, I think we've locked down the performance here. Seems really good, even up to 4K, although at 4K I think tweaking down to the high settings is probably the way to go, or even medium if you're wanting a higher refresh rate experience. In general, I think the high settings are a nice place to be in this game, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.